Okay. All right, so before we talk about water, actually, let me go to this next slide. There's a couple of things that you do need to understand. Don't worry about drawing this just yet, because you're not going to draw the whole thing. You're going to draw a simplified version of it, and that there's a box there. So let me just quickly make a couple of comments about bonding that you need to know before we get into the structure of water. First of all, basically you learned in chemistry, I hope, that there were two major kinds of bonds. You had ionic and you had covalent. What was the difference between them?
Ionic, like the bond, or one of them has like all the 8, right?
Yeah, one of them they end up with 8. They both kind of go along with getting 8, but one of them has to do with getting 8 by sharing, exactly, and the other one has to do with getting 8 by one taking electrons from the other. So does anybody remember which one shares? Covalent shares. But the truth of the matter is, everything is either ionic or covalent, because it's all based on electronegativity, which is how much an atom wants to pull electrons towards it. So if you have two things with exactly the same electronegativity, yes, you're going to have a perfectly covalent bond. They're going to be in a tug of war. Neither one is going to be able to take electrons from the other, and you're going to have perfect sharing. But most of the time, if you've got two different elements, their electronegativities are not going to be exactly the same, because every element has a different number of electrons. So there's this whole gray area in between where they share perfectly to they share not so perfectly, to where one of them has the ability to take from the other. So water is one of those where they're sharing, but it's the sharing that's not so perfectly. So if we look at it, what you need to know about water, the specifics as far as its structure and relating this to the bonds of water, you need to know that, first of all, it is covalent, but its structure is polar covalent. And that means that the sharing of the electrons is uneven. So in the case of water, and this is really the diagram that I would want you to know, and you don't have to draw all the little dots and things, it's really just an oxygen, a hydrogen, and a hydrogen. And it actually is bent. You don't have to know the actual angle or anything like that. But the idea is this: because oxygen is sort of a big bulky molecule, it tends to pull electrons towards it. And so even though it's sharing, it's sort of like if I was sharing a candy bar with you, but I basically took most of the candy bar and gave you a little piece. That's sort of what's happening here. They're sharing electrons, but the electrons are much more attracted to oxygen than they are to hydrogen. Now, what charge do electrons themselves have? A negative charge, which means that if the electrons are hanging around oxygen more, oxygen's actually going to end up with not a full negative charge, because that's what happens in ionic things, but a partial negative charge. And this little symbol here means partial. And the hydrogens are going to end up with partial positive charges. So they have a slight positive charge because the electrons are hanging around them a little less. And the oxygen has a partial negative charge because the electrons are hanging around it a little more. Sound familiar, I hope, maybe from chem or from bio? So that's called polar covalent, this uneven sharing. And we just said they have partial charges, which this symbol represents. The other thing is, though, opposites attract. So that means that if this has a slightly positive charge, it's going to be attracted to other things that have a negative charge. So anything that has a negative charge or a slightly negative charge is going to be attracted to these hydrogens. And anything that has a positive or slightly positive charge is going to be attracted to this oxygen. And so what ends up forming are these very weak, they call them bonds, but they're not even really bonds. They are actually just really strong attractions. And that's these over here, which you don't need to draw, but you should be familiar with what a hydrogen bond is. And this is also in that basic chemistry lecture online. So here's your hydrogen bonds here. And what's happening is that this water molecule is being attracted to all these other water molecules. Another place where you may have learned about hydrogen bonds would have been in DNA. I don't know how well you remember learning about DNA, but it was like this double helix, and then you had these bases in the middle, and like A connected to T, and T to A, and G to C, like that. And you may have remembered it being drawn with little dots, these little connections here being dots. They were also hydrogen bonds, things. So it's called a bond, but it's really more like Velcro, a very, very weak attraction. So this is not permanent. What's actually happening is these water molecules are sliding past each other. But when they slide past each other, they sort of get stuck just split second to each other. And so they get stuck and then they slide, and they get stuck and they slide. And this is going to give water some special properties. So your book donates an entire chapter just to the properties that water has. Because this structure, this whole polar covalent with the partial charges and hydrogen bonds, that's basically the key to what allows life to exist on this planet. All right, so properties of water. The first one is that water is an excellent solvent. So solvent has to do with making solutions. What's the other part of a solution besides the solvent? Right, the solute. So the solute is basically dissolved in the solvent. Water is called the universal solvent. It basically can dissolve more stuff than any other solvent that we know of. And in your bodies, for example, you've got a completely watery environment. Remember, you're made of like 60-70% water. Your blood is like 97% water. And so inside your cells, the environment inside and the environment outside, all watery. And so you've got all these ions floating around, in other words, dissolved substances that are floating around inside of your body, and that's going to allow all the reactions that occur in your body to keep you alive, like cell respiration, like muscle contraction, like brain function, all of that stuff. Because it's polar, it basically dissolves anything else that's polar, as well as anything that's ionic. Remember, polar would have to do with having partial charges, and ionic would have to do with having full-blown charges. So any kind of salts are going to separate in water. And that's just a little diagram of just ionic stuff dissolving. By the way, anybody recognize in the picture on the left what that thing is going across the middle? Yeah, close. Did you say? It's yes, potassium. She said cell wall, but that's not quite cell wall. Cell membrane, plasma membrane. Well, you should say it louder. Cell membrane, which you may remember is like semi-permeable, it lets some things through. The reason why is because the cell membrane is made out of phospholipids. Lipids, if you remember, fats and water don't mix. And so the cell membrane can control what goes in and out because it has the property of not liking water. Now stuff that likes water is called hydrophilic, like philos, love, water loving. And again, that's most substances that we see in our bodies. Because almost everything that's going on in our bodies, these are ionic compounds or they're covalent compounds that are polar. Like even sugars are polar, even proteins have polar portions. So most of the chemicals that compose us are polar or ionic. Substances that are not polar, that don't like water, hydrophobic, which actually doesn't mean water hating. What would it mean? Do you know?
Afraid of water.
Right, afraid of water, like a phobia, a fear. The most common example of this would be lipids, fats, oils, even cholesterol, things like that. They don't like water. And they're important too, because like I said, the cell membrane, which has got lipids in it, it actually can act as a barrier, as a control. The fact that it's not crazy about water is what allows it to control what enters and leaves. This last little line here, you won't be tested on. So you don't have to, you can write it if you want to, but hydrophobic exclusion, it basically is just a term that refers to the fact that stuff that doesn't like water tends to glob together and separate from water. You don't have to know that term for a test or anything. Think about oil. If you have like oil and vinegar and you shake it up, the oil will separate into little bubbles, but then if you leave it there for a couple minutes, it'll just glob back together. And that's what they're referring to. Hydrophobic exclusion is the idea that covalent non-polar things will tend to glob together in water. Again, you won't be tested on that. Oh, and this PowerPoint, I'll have it online tomorrow, because tomorrow we'll finish it up. Second property that water has, we're going to call it stickiness. But the actual term for it, or terms, the scientific terms, would be cohesive and adhesive. I'm pretty sure you've heard these terms before also. Cohesive means water molecules stick to each other. It sticks to itself. And adhesive means it sticks to surfaces. It sticks to other things. Think about a waxed car. Wax is a type of lipid. And remember, water and lipids don't mix. So when you put water on a waxed car, what does it do?
Like beats off.
Right, it makes these like little beads, right? And it kind of runs off. Well, that's because the water molecules are cohesive. They stick to each other and form the beads, but they're not adhesive to the waxed car because it's a lipid surface. But they are adhesive, for example, to the little teeny tiny tubes inside of plants. Remember, plants need water, obviously, in order to survive. They can only absorb water at the roots, even though people go around spritzing the leaves. That doesn't do anything. The leaves cannot take in water. What can take in water only is the roots, and then the water has to get from the roots to the leaves, which typically is against gravity. It's traveling up. What's going to allow it to do that is that as water evaporates, there's going to be this pull from the top, but the water is attracted to the sides, and the molecules of water stick together, and so they travel up the leaf. A good example of this that you've probably all seen is when they prick your finger to check your blood in the doctor's office, and they take that little glass tube and they touch it to the blood. It's so cool, and the blood just sort of gets sucked up the tube magically. That's because blood is 97% water. And water molecules are polar, and they're attracted to each other, and they're attracted to the inside of the tube, and having such a tiny diameter, as a little bit gets sucked up, more of it follows. It wouldn't keep going till it spurts out the other side or anything, but that is why it travels up the tube. Another property of water that goes along with this is it has high surface tension, which basically means, what it sounds like, that the molecules on the surface stick to each other also. So you have almost this invisible film of water sticking to itself on the surface, and it resists being broken. Why is this important for living things? Well, for one thing, this is what allows, for example, little water striders and bugs like that to walk on the surface of the water. It ends up preventing water also from evaporating. You can lay a paper clip carefully on the surface of water. If you'd like, I'll give you a paper clip and go home today and try it. Paper clips on the surface of water, they'll sort of float there, they won't break through. And that's because of the surface tension of water. Not all liquids would do that. You could do a little science experiment, put it on oil and put it on alcohol and put it on other things, and water has a very high surface tension. This is also why a belly flop hurts when you dive into the water and you land wrong. That's because the water resists your breaking through for a split second. If you do a belly flop from high enough, you'll die. It's like hitting a wall, because that resistance, that split second of resistance, is going to prevent you from going through. And basically, if you're in a plane crash, the stewardesses are all, there's going to be an exit here, and the whole plane's going to be an exit, because the water's going to rip the plane into pieces, because it's the surface tension of the water is that strong. So don't go flying this week after that story. But that's surface tension. The next characteristic of water is that it's a good temperature moderator. Basically, that means its temperature doesn't change very well. It basically helps to keep temperatures stable. One of the reasons that I said that when they go and look at planets, they look for was there ever water there? Is it possible for water to exist there? Because water keeps temperatures in the right range for living things. Scientifically, we call this a high specific heat. A high specific heat means that water can absorb a lot of energy without actually getting hotter. You've experienced this, I'm sure, if you ever go swimming. In the spring, when it starts to warm up, although it's kind of warm here all year, but in the spring it starts to warm up, and it may be getting into the 80s outside, but your pool is still cold. That's because the water heat warms up extremely slowly. It resists temperature changes. This is important to living things, for example, that live under the water. I went to Colorado one summer. It was early June. In the daytime, it was like 80 degrees. At night, it was still dropping down to the 50s. So if you're an organism that lives on land, you would have to have some kind of a mechanism to warm and cool yourself. But if you live in the water, since water temperature changes very slowly, organisms in the water are protected. The temperature changes are going to be very minor, or they're going to be very gradual, and so this is going to protect the things that live in water. And the fact that we're made of water, and that means that the water temperature inside of us also changes very slowly, that's going to keep our temperature fairly stable. So that's going to protect living things from temperature changes. I don't know if there was something to write there. Everybody good? Metal has a very low specific heat. If you think about it, you put a pot on the stove with some water in it. After a minute, if you touch the bottom of the pot, you'll get burned. But you can still probably touch the water, and it's barely warmed up at all. Because the water is warming very slowly, it's absorbing the heat without getting hotter.